Hello everyone, Mr. Walker here. In this lesson, I'm going to be talking about different reproductive strategies. So what we see on this first slide, we already know most of the details about. So we've talked about what's taking place in males with the formation of sperm, spermatogenesis, but of course that is meiosis. In the case of females, the formation of the egg, oogenesis, that's meiosis as well. And what we do know is that meiosis does create gametes. It creates cells that do have variability, so they're not all the same. And it also results in the reduction of the chromosome number. So when we're talking about mammals and when we're talking about humans, meiosis, for the most part, is taking a diploid cells. Remember, diploid means you have two copies of each chromosome, and this is the symbol that we use for that, and cutting the chromosome number in half, reducing the chromosome number to haploid cells. But it can also be taking a tetraploid cell having four copies. There are some organisms, plants in particular, that some of them do have four copies of each chromosome. So during meiosis, they wouldn't form haploid cells. They would, again, cut the chromosome number in half, which would make them diploid cells. When we do have gametes coming together, we'll assume that they're the haploid gametes. We know that that is the process of fertilization. So we have our haploid sperm, we have our haploid egg. The process of fertilization is going to create the first cell of that new organism, the diploid cell, the fertilized egg, or the zygote. And again, if we're talking about humans, as it shows in the picture here, that means the sperm would have 23, the egg would have 23 chromosomes, and our first cell, the zygote, would then have 46 chromosomes. And then, of course, through the process of mitosis, what we're going to do is take that single cell, divide it many, many, many times to get the trillions of cells that we do have in a baby and in an adult body. All of those are going to be diploid cells. They're going to have 46 chromosomes when we're talking about humans, and all of those are going to be genetically identical because mitosis does just that, generate genetically identical cells. Whereas meiosis is reduction cell division, mitosis is conservation cell division. So in this example here, what we're taking is diploid cells and we're creating other diploid cells. But just like there is another kind of meiosis in terms of the chromosome number, there is also with mitosis. So if we start with haploid cells, mitosis would then generate other haploid cells. So that is also mitosis, conserving the chromosome number. So in this lesson, I'm going to talk about different life cycles that organisms do have in addition to this one that we have here. This is the standard model for humans and for many mammals, but it's different when we do take a look at other living organisms. So let's take a look at a few examples here. So in the case of plants, they have both a sexual and an asexual reproduction stage, which means that they can just reproduce by forming sperm and eggs, just like we do, but they can also reproduce without the formation of sperm and eggs. So asexual reproduction takes several different forms. So a few examples that I do have here. So this first picture is showing binary fission. Fission is just the splitting apart. So we start with one single cell that we do have here in this amoeba, and then we get to what are referred to as daughter cells. So this is through the process of mitosis where we get those two cells, which means that these two cells would be genetically identical to each other and also identical to, well, the original one that they started with in the first place. So that is one kind of sexual reproduction. A couple of other examples here, the aquatic organism, the hydra. What we do see is right here, we have a little bit of, well, what's called a bud that grows, it sticks out, and then eventually it actually breaks free. So this is a fragment of, or a bud of the hydra, which is eventually going to form another hydra, an adult version of it, if you will, and it would be identical, genetically identical to the original one that we started with. The last example here that we also see in plants is we see this one parent plant which is generating some offspring, but not again by producing the sperm and the eggs. So in this case, what we do have, and this could either be up above the ground or below the ground, or runner going down below the ground as well. But here we have kind of an offshoot from the parent plant, taking root in the soil, forming the roots and the stems and the leaves, and eventually getting a new plant. So in this case here, because it did come from, and in fact, there is this physical connection to the original plant, this would also be asexual reproduction. And the two plants that we do get, the original one and the new plant that forms, they would again be genetically identical to each other. That is the case with asexual reproduction. This one here, kind of an interesting one, parthenogenesis. This is a reproduction that is taking place, which is also asexual in nature. And in this case here, there is no necessity for a sperm. So what we do have is an unfertilized egg that develops into an adult. So this can be an adult that in fact is haploid. So the cells don't have two copies of each chromosome, or we can have the doubling of the chromosomes in the gamete and end up with an individual, an adult, which is diploid, but those chromosomes are identical and it's no different than the original one that we did start with. So that is parthenogenesis. So kind of a classic example here is what we do see in bees. And what this picture does show us is there can be sexual reproduction that is taking place. So if we have the male bee and we have our female bee, so this is the sexual reproduction that's taking place here. Both of them through the process of meiosis, spermatogenesis in the male. Oh, sorry, let me correct myself on this one. In this case, our male is haploid. So in order to get sperm in this case, well, it's actually going to be mitosis. So we did talk about, again, that mitosis is conservation division. So here it's not diploid to diploid. If we want to form the sperm are haploid cells. But if we're starting with haploid cells in the first place, then it's only mitosis that's going to generate these cells. So we do have the sperm. And then in the case of the female is diploid. So just like with humans, it is the process of meiosis, oogenesis, that's going to form the haploid egg from the diploid adult that we started with in the first place. So what can happen is, well, sexual reproduction, those two gametes come together through fertilization, and what we form is a diploid cell, and this diploid cell is going to be a female. So depending upon the environmental conditions, that female may end up being the queen if she is exposed to what's called the royal jelly, or regular honey will just result in a regular diploid sterile worker female. What about the males? Well, the males in this case are going to be forming from parthenogenesis, where we do have egg cells and no fertilization that is taking place. So if there's no fertilization, these haploid ones, which are referred to as the drones. So here we do have reproduction taking place, but it's reproduction without the fertilization of this egg, and that is what the term parthenogenesis is specifically referring to. Another nice example here, this is the Plasmodium parasite, which is responsible for malaria. And if we start this one, maybe right down at the bottom here, where what we have entering into the mosquito here is what is called a gametocyte. So if you remember from reproduction, spermatocytes give rise to sperm, oocytes give rise to the eggs or the oocytes. So gametocytes in this case are going to be diploid versions of the Plasmodium parasite that enter into the mosquito. So once they're in the mosquito, these gametocytes, which are diploid, are going to go and undergo meiosis to form the haploid sperm and the haploid eggs. So each of these here, this would be our diploid male gametocyte, and the other one would be the diploid female gametocyte. If I just draw off to the side here, what we're going to have is the process of meiosis, And that process of meiosis is going to form the haploid sperm and the haploid eggs. So what are these two going to do? Well, they're going to come together and they're going to form what is called the oocyst. So this oocyst that we have here, it is our diploid cell. So that diploid cell is then going to divide through the process of mitosis to form many of these oocysts within the mosquito. So now the mosquito is going to bite the human and it's going to pass on these sporozoites into the human through the saliva of the mosquito. So once it reaches into the human, it's going to make its way to the liver. And then we're again going to have mitosis taking place. So mitotic replication. Eventually, those liver cells are going to rupture, releasing a whole bunch of these parasites. And what these parasites can then do is just continue to go through this process here, which is asexual reproduction or mitosis, to produce more of those particular cells, to infect more of the liver cells and even the red blood cells. But now we have red blood cells that are showing at the lower right-hand side that are being infected. So these ones that are now infected, these are the ones that can be picked up by the mosquitoes. So once they're picked up by the mosquitoes, they're once again transformed into these gametocytes, and those gametocytes are then going to continue the cycle by again forming haploid cells. So if you are given a picture like this, usually what it comes down to is, can you identify where the haploid cells are? Can you identify where the diploid cells are? Where is fertilization taking place? Where is mitosis taking place? And where is meiosis taking place? So we'll do the same thing, only now we'll talk about plants. And with plants, it's a little bit different because they go through both, again, asexual and sexual reproduction. And that's quite often what is referred to as the alternation of generations. So one generation will be diploid, the next generation will be haploid, and back and forth and back and forth. And they alternate as well between sexual reproduction and asexual reproduction. So a little bit of language that goes along with this as well before we get to this picture down at the bottom here, which is showing the life cycle for fern. So in this case, the diploid version of a multicellular adult plant, it is referred to as a sporophyte. So what a sporophyte does is it produces spores, but spores are haploid. So if the adult plants are diploid, and the haploid spores are haploid, that means it is reduction division. So the way that sporophytes form spores is through the process of meiosis. What do these spores do? Well, they're not gametes and they don't unite together during fertilization. But what these spores do is they divide by mitosis. And what they form is a multicellular version of the plant, which is haploid. So the cells in this multicellular plant, they only have one copy of each chromosome, and they are referred to as the gametophyte. So sporophytes produce spores, gametophytes do produce gametes. But we already have cells that are haploid. So you can't have meiosis producing the gametes in this place. In this case, you're going to have mitosis. So whereas sporophytes are going to be forming the spores, haploid spores through meiosis, the gametophytes are going to be forming the gametes through the process of mitosis. Now, fortunately, the gametes in this case just do what gametes normally do, and that is they unite together during the process of fertilization. So we're taking haploid gametes that were formed by the gametophyte, they join together, and the language that we're familiar with, they form the diploid zygote. And from that point on, we kind of know what happens. The zygote, what they do is divide through mitosis. We get a multicellular plant, and that multicellular plant takes us back to where we started in the first place, and that was with our diploid sporophyte. So the picture that we do have here is showing the life cycle of a fern. And this fern, it says that the dominant generation is diploid. So when you are taking a look at a fern plant, it is the diploid version of the plant that we're taking a look at. At certain times, though, it does form the sporophyte version, but it's not the dominant version. It's not the one that's most visible in the fern plant. So we start off on the left-hand side here with our diploid version of the plant. So this is our fern. All of these cells inside of this plant, they are going to be diploid. So this diploid plant is then called the sporophyte. What does a sporophyte do? Well, we just said that sporophytes produce spores. But spores aren't diploid. Spores are haploid. So how do we get from diploid to haploid? Well, we have to use the process of meiosis. Sporophytes, some of the cells undergo meiosis, they produce the spores. Again, spores aren't gametes, they don't join together. Instead, they go ahead and they divide through the process of mitosis. They form another version of the multicellular plant, and that version is now called the gametophyte, whereas the sporophyte was diploid, the gametophyte is haploid. The gametophyte produces gametes. Gametes have to be haploid, but our parent plant is already haploid. We can't use meiosis, so we have to use mitosis to produce the gametes. Once we get the gametes, they join together through fertilization, forming the diploid zygote, which then undergoes multiple stages of mitosis to eventually get us back to, well, the sporophyte we did start with in the first place. The next picture that I'll show you, it is really exactly the same. The only difference between this one and the previous one, well, I guess two differences. This one is the moss. And secondly, in this case, in the moss, it is the haploid version that is going to be the dominant one. So when you do take a look at a moss growing on the forest floor, that is the haploid version of the plant. That is the gametophyte. So here they have identified the male and the female gametophyte. Male gametophytes produce the gametes, so the male gametophyte is going to produce the sperm. But again, these are already haploid. The sperm are haploid, the egg is haploid. So what's going to take us from the gametophyte to the gametes is going to be meiosis, or mitosis. Conservation division, mitosis. What do these gametes do? Well, right in here, it's going to be fertilization. They come together. What do we end up with? Our diploid zygote. What does our zygote do? It divides through mitosis to give us the diploid version of the plant, which is our sporophyte. Sporophyte in this case, kind of interesting. This is our moss that we have here. Very small vegetation growing on the forest floor. That is our haploid plant. The sporophyte in this case actually grows right up on top. The capsule, it's inside of those capsules that we do have the spores, and the spores again are haploid. So going from the sporophyte to the haploid spores, that's where we have to use the process of meiosis. So again, if you're given a question on an exam where it is dealing with life cycles or it's dealing with something like this, the alternation of generations, really what they're asking you to do in both cases is identify where do you have cells that are diploid? Where do you have cells that are haploid? Where does fertilization take place? Where does mitosis take place? And where does meiosis take place? So I'll just summarize this with this diagram here. So with this diagram, I'm just using red and blue to represent different sexes. So we'll use the red for the female and blue for the male. So sporophytes are diploid. So these ones have 2 copies of each chromosome. These ones here have 2 copies of each chromosome. Spores, as we talked about, they're haploid. Haploid for this one, haploid for this one. So how do we get from diploid to haploid? Well, this arrow here must be meiosis. This one here, similarly, is going to be meiosis. Now we have our spores, our single-celled spores, which are haploid, which are going to form a multicellular haploid version of the plant, which is called the gametophyte. Gametophytes are haploid. So how do we go from a single cell spore to a multicellular gametophyte, which is also haploid? Well, this must be the process of mitosis. Now we have our gametophyte. The gametophytes are going to form the gametes. Gametophytes are already haploid, and so are the gametes going to be haploid. So now it is conservation division. For humans, it is meiosis that produces the gametes, but not here. So here, because we're going haploid to haploid, it is going to be mitosis. Now the gametes coming from the two different sexes. So this one here then would be our egg. And over on the right-hand side in blue, this would be our sperm. And they do what they normally do. The sperm will fertilize the egg. So this process going right across the middle, this is going to be fertilization. What does that get us? Well, it gets us back to our diploid cells. Diploid zygote here, diploid zygote here, and now all we need to do is complete the cycle. So we're going to take that zygote and eventually get it back to being a sporophyte, and that requires the process of mitosis, both over here and exactly the same thing on the right-hand side.